Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISUEO Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and today I'm here with our Extension Dairy Team colleagues, Dr. Gail Carpenter and Larry Tranel, as we recap a webinar discussion around feeding fodder and its feasibility, effectiveness, and challenges of implementing on our dairy farms. And then we're also going to learn more about what's going on with dairy research at the University of Minnesota's West Central and Research Center in Morris, Minnesota. So our guest here today is Dr. Brad Heins. He's a professor of organic dairy management at the University of Minnesota's West Central Research Center in Morris, Minnesota. The center has 130 head herd in a certified organic system and 160 head herd in a conventional grazing system. His research and extension program focuses on best management practices for dairy production, crossbreeding of dairy cattle, group rearing of calves, and renewable energy for dairy production systems. So welcome to the podcast, Gail and Larry, and a warm welcome to Dr. Heins.
It's great to be here, Jen.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I hope Brad doesn't feel too outnumbered with the Iowa group, being the lonely Minnesotan there. But
No, not at all. Not at all.
Right.
I have some Iowa roots.
Are you from Iowa?
I am not from Iowa, but
Okay.
my father grew up in Sumner, so Bremer County.
Oh, sure.
Ah.
Yep.
Well, and Jen, you're not too far from the Minnesota border, right?
Yeah, I guess I could claim Minnesota too. Right. Yep.
We've got some transitional members.
Yeah, so Dr. Heins, your webinar a couple of weeks ago was focused around fodder, and I know this has been kind of a topic of sorts in the last couple of years. Sometimes it comes to the forefront, and it seemed to kind of resurface again. So we thought we'd bring up the topic and kind of discuss it a little bit further. So why don't you give us a background of how fodder was developed, and when are you seeing an increase in people, thinking about it or growing it?
Well, we usually see fodder sort of rear itself in times of drought or possibly in times of a lot of wet weather. I've ventured off into fodder research back in 2015, I think, or 2014, when there was some droughts in Minnesota and a lot of farmers were putting in fodder systems and as a way to maybe help provide more feed for cows. And then it kind of went away for a little bit because hay got cheaper and feed got a little bit cheaper. But now as costs go up, people are starting to explore more ways. And fodder is another way that people are exploring. It's starting to get a little more traction, or at least interest again in the dairy industry, for better or for worse, I guess. And I think there's some good things and some bad things about it, but it seems to come about big time in drought. And we're experiencing that at least in Minnesota and Wisconsin. I'm not sure about Iowa, maybe a little bit of drought in Iowa too. And so it's been tough. And so farmers are scrambling, trying to figure out, how am I going to have enough feed for winter or other things. So that's kind of why it's popped up again, really.
Can you give us a little bit, for those listening, what do you mean when you say fodder? I always thought of fodder as just another, like a Dutch sounding term for food, but I think that's when we're talking about fodder, we mean something a little more specific when we're talking about dairy cattle.
Well, I think fodder is probably the farmer term that we all that we probably say. It's sprouted grains. So we're sprouting grain with water and light, basically, and for about 7 days. And so the grain grows and can produce this fodder, as we call it. So it's green, lush green forage from the grain after about 7 days of growth. So that's kind of what we mean with fodder.
So we've seen people asking questions about it, right, in some recent months. And I think you're probably right. I think a lot of that has to come back to drought. You did some research in this area not too long ago. What were you testing in this research, and what are some of the things that you found?
Well, we kind of had a lot of different interests on fodder when I started. Um, the first one was really looking at the type of grains that we used. So, barley was probably the number one grain that farmers used in the upper Midwest here and probably in the Northeast. So, the Northeast was doing a lot of fodder growing as well. And so, of course, being a researcher, I didn't believe that barley was the number one grain. So I set out to test different grains. So we used barley, oats, wheat, triticale, and rye just to see what would happen with growing those different forage species. And well, I think the results showed that barley was probably the best one. Oats was not so bad. And, we kind of rated those based on how much fodder, how much biomass they produced. The barley did the best, produced the most biomass. Oats was second best. Rye and triticale did not work. I would not recommend those whatsoever. It just didn't sprout very well. I think it takes a lot longer to sprout rye and triticale than it does some of the other grains. Plus, they had a lot of mold growth. Didn't see as much mold with barley and oats as I did the other one. So that's kind of how we based it on. The most biomass, less mold are probably the two biggest factors that a farmer should consider when producing fodder.
So you said you sprout they're normally sprouted for 7 days. Have you looked at that timing at all? Is there a time, a sprouting days by species interaction or anything like that? Is it different? Is there a sweet spot? Is 7 days kind of a magic number?
Well,
that was like
really
5 questions. So,
it's a good question, Gail. 7 days is really probably built around the days of the week. So you're always seeding and harvesting every day. So at some point, so that's just what you do. You're harvesting and seeding every day. So if you're off on, one, maybe 5 days or 8 or 9 days, it's really hard to determine in a fodder system what you should harvest and what you should seed again. So I think that's really how it got determined was it's pretty easy on a 7-day basis. And obviously if you let these, say barley, if you let it grow for longer, you're going to get more forage and biomass. There's no doubt about it. You can let it go 10 days or more and get a lot more. But trying to keep track of that in your system is probably difficult. So, and if you go, less than 7, you just don't get the biomass that you should. It starts producing a lot of biomass around day 5, and 6 and 7 are heavy growth time. So anything less than 5 is really, I wouldn't do it either. Yeah. So I think 7 is kind of the sweet spot based on growth and just making it easier to harvest and seed.
Yeah. So, we talk about, this is one of these things that comes up every few years when we have weird weather patterns, whether that's extra drought or extra rain. But what you just described sounds kind of like the whole system, right? It's not, I assume it's something you can't just, pop up out of nowhere and have going for a year at a time. What does a producer need to get started with fodder or sprouted grains?
Well, that's probably that's the big question. So obviously I say you need a fodder system to be able to grow it, to actually get growth and make it worthwhile. I've seen some farmers just growing it on a slab of concrete. I've seen some grown in eave spouts, or some just on a bunch of, metal or wherever it might be. They just tend not to get the growth. If you want to get good growth, you almost have to have a system to do that. So I have a fodder tech, farm tech system. So from Iowa, and it's basically every day has 28 trays. So the trays are about 6 feet long and a little more than a foot wide. So you basically have 28 trays that you harvest and you seed every day. It's a bank of 7. We have some additional grow lights that we put in there. That was maybe one thing that we didn't think of. So I should say we put this in a retrofit pig barn. So I put it in a nursery barn. Not as many sort of lights and sunlight coming in. So we included some more grow lights in there. I'm not entirely sure that the grow lights actually helped grow more fodder. I think the sunlight peeking through the windows probably grew more fodder than anything. So that's one consideration is I think sunlight is better. And if you can have more sunlight in there, I thought about doing this in a greenhouse. A greenhouse might be perfect where you're getting lots of good sunlight and you'll get lots of growth. The problem with putting it in a greenhouse is water. So you got to water these things like a lot. And there's a lot of water. And we had a pit underneath our system so we could collect all the water, but it used a lot of water, especially in the first few days where you're watering just a bunch of seeds and there's a lot of runoff. So you have to collect all of that water. So that, those were probably the two biggest things was how much water these systems use, and lights for growth are a big consideration.
So you said 28 trays?
28 trays every
per
single
day. How many trays, how many cows does 28 trays feed?
So this one was about 20 cows.
Okay.
Our system was about 20 cows. You could, if I got more, yes, 20 cows. So if I'd have got a little bit more growth, it could probably go to 30 cows. I had a smaller system, was very manual, lots of manual labor. I know I did some of this stuff, especially on the weekends. It was my job was to do the harvest and the seeding. So I got thrust into that activity as well.
Yeah. I thought you were a full professor now and you didn't have to do stuff like that.
Oh no, Gail, I do more outside now than I used to, but I enjoy it.
Yeah.
So with the labor involved and the output of the nutritional content, what does it look like economically for somebody to think about it?
So if you think about it, so kind of a brief thing. So we did a cow study as well. So we fed about 20 cows with fodder and 20 cows with no fodder. And it really came down to you have to think about fodder on an economic basis, and you have to think about it on a dry matter basis. That's the big kicker. So you're only feeding maybe 2 or 3 pounds of dry matter per cow per day, at least in our production system. So it's not a lot. A lot of people think that these systems can supply lots of forage and for cows to meet their nutritional requirements, and they really can't. You're going to need to supplement with something. But if you think about it from an economic standpoint, on a dry matter basis, it's really expensive, and I think Larry has done some of this work and we have done it, and it really comes down to about $800 a ton if you think about it from a dry matter basis. That's including seeds, labor, energy, water, all of that goes into the system. So it can be some expensive feed if you're not prepared for it, because you have to think about it on a dry matter basis and not just as fed what's coming out of the system.
Yeah, so on a cost per pound of dry matter, like when I was taking a look at it, a lot of times it was in 40 to 50 cents per pound of dry matter. So yeah, that $800 a ton is not out of the ordinary. And sometimes when people take a look at that, all costs are not included either. So you mentioned about the high water, a lot of labor, just buying the barley to begin with, because you're tending to be buying, I think, more of a higher quality barley. Is that what you guys were using, Brad?
Yeah, we were using some higher quality barley to try and reduce mold and get some pretty good growth.
Yeah, if we don't use mold's going to be quite a bit higher. So by the time all these costs are included, it gets to be a very expensive forage. And I think a lot of times when people are trying to sell this system to people, they're trying to, sell it on their the poundage of how much forage you actually get out. But Brad's definitely right that you got to take this back to a pound of dry matter, because a pound of dry matter is a pound of dry matter. And what are the nutrients? There might be some smaller changes in the nutrient content of it, but again, pound for pound, is it worth the extra money? I tend to think not.
You said that in your trial you were feeding cows fodder and not fodder. Is fodder kind of an all or nothing thing, or is it possible to fit it into a feeding system?
Well, we put it in. We mixed it in with the TMR. So we had some corn silage and some haylage in the mix, and basically we replaced the grain with fodder. So that was our goal, was to take some of the grain out, because grain is expensive as well. But trying to replace grain is difficult as well, and fodder it couldn't replace the grain. It changed. We didn't find any difference in our lactating cow study. So there was no difference in milk production, somatic cell count, you name it, for the cows that were fed fodder in the ration or not. It maybe changed the fatty acid profile of the milk. So we had higher omega-3s in the milk than with cows that were on fodder. But that's because we're feeding more green forage. So
right.
That's, so that's really all we found. And, we did some back of the napkin economic calculations, and I figured that corn had to be above $15 to make it worthwhile. And I'm not sure that we'll see corn above $15 anytime soon, or at least I hope not. That'll
knock on wood.
Really expensive stuff. So that's really where the economics come into play too, with production and everything. It's an expensive forage, and it doesn't necessarily replace a lot of other ingredients in the ration.
Yeah, so just kind of an interesting topic to discuss and kind of weigh out those pros and cons as producers are looking at alternative forages. I know with your research farm there, you do quite a bit of research. Maybe you can kind of move into that subject of giving us a background of what your research farm is all about, and maybe some projects that are going on.
Yeah, Jen, sorry. It's kind of funny. I was talking to somebody the other day about Dr. Heins, and they said, well, what does he study? And I said, everything.
I hope it was good, Gail. I hope you're talking good stuff about me. Sometimes people don't, but that's it.
I don't know. Yeah, if I was to describe what you do, I think I've heard all sorts of projects come out of Morris there, and it seems like you've got a little playground out there where you can test just about everything.
You are correct. I do just about anything and everything. We take a systems approach, so it's not necessarily one thing. People might know I'm a geneticist by training, so I like genetics, but I've ventured into many different projects here at our research center. So we're a 300 cow pasture-based dairy. We have about 120 cows that are organic in an organic production system, and about 180 cows that are in a low input conventional system, more grazing based, no freestall barn, they're outdoor housed, things like that. So that's kind of a background, and it's about a third Holstein and 2/3 crossbred. A lot of the different projects. So, I like to do calf stuff. So we've been looking at calf housing systems, raising calves individually versus pairs versus groups, or raising them on a cow. So it's been an interesting project. We just finished that up here this year, and are looking for the results from my graduate students. So it's been an interesting project. Calves raised on their mom do quite well. One thing we're finding out now is a few of the cows that are coming into milk 2 years later, or almost 3 years later, a few of them have yonis. So And
Uh-oh.
even though we tested all of the cows for yonis, that doesn't, we know our herd has yonis. And but testing them, were all negative at the time, but then, a couple of years later, they might show up as positive. And yonis is one of those funny diseases. If you have it, you have to learn to manage it. But so we're seeing a few of the calves that were on their mom are popping up yonis, and some is not, it's like, well, where'd they get it from? Because the dam has been tested 5 times negative, and it's like, oh, they were stealing milk off of somebody else. Well, that's one thing that we've noticed. Not very many calves, but we've had 1 or 2. We've also been doing some disbudding things, so looking at pain mitigation for dehorning calves, looking at polled genetics more in that aspect. Some of the projects we've got going on now, so we're looking at feeding red seaweed to our grazing cows as a way to reduce methane emissions. So we have a couple really expensive methane collectors here on pastures that we've been collecting this data, and we're hopefully going to get to the end of the year before it snows and keep collecting data on those cows. Dairy beef. So this is one that I've just started, kind of like Gail's playing in the dairy beef world. I am as well. I don't believe that one breed is the magic bullet. So we've bred our herd to Angus, Limousin, Charolais, Simmental, and Hereford, and are looking at sire breed effects on breeding to dairy cows. Let's see, what else are we doing? I do agrivoltaic, so that's grazing cows underneath solar panels. That's been quite the hot topic, probably in Minnesota, in the upper Midwest, with lots of solar installations going in. Colorado, it's a really hot topic now. There's lots of big beef ranches looking at putting solar on their land for shade and grazing. I dabble a little bit in mastitis treatments, alternative mastitis treatments, and going to venture into looking at parasites in organic and grazing animals and looking at genetics of parasites. So we kind of, there's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah.
I'm sure I missed some too.
What's been your funnest research project?
Actually, so far, I've really enjoyed raising the calves in different housing systems. I think that's, even though it was sort of 10 years after I started here, that's one that's probably been the most exciting to work with. And for those of you that have fed calves individually, I don't like to do it. I started this project during COVID. So I fed a lot of the calves in the evening by myself, individually, and in pairs and groups. And I just hate feeding calves individually. It takes so much time. And I'm a group feeding person. I'm not necessarily sold on the raising calves on cows. I think there's lots of good things about it, but there's lots of things to consider. So I think that's been probably the most fun I've had since I've been here with research projects. So,
and when you're feeding them in group housing, you're using auto feeders, right? You're not mob feeding or anything like that.
Well, we have both. So
Okay.
I have an auto feeder as well, but we're also using a mob feeder outside. So, and really you get about the same response. Auto feeders are nice, but they're really expensive. If you want to group feed calves a much cheaper way and have smaller calf numbers, mob feeding works and does a great job of raising calves.
So what do people need to know if they're going to start raising calves in groups? Group housing.
Well, you should do it in small numbers. So if you want to start out small. Don't just put a whole bunch of calves in a group. We've started with 5 or 6. We've kind of settled in about 10 right now. I'm the crazy guy that's put 30 on a auto feeder, couple nipples to see what would happen. But I think if you're going to mob feed, 10 is about the right number for space and being able to put them on a feeder. So it's worked out well. You also want to make sure that about 2 weeks difference in age. So you don't want to just, because there could be some competition between the young calves and the old calves. So you kind of want to limit ages in a pen, and you can put 3 in a pen too. Even 3 is better. I'm not a big fan of pair housed. I think that's individual housing with the same labor. It just has a buddy. And I get the whole social aspect, but it doesn't save in labor.
Yeah.
Do you notice, because you have different breeds, do you notice they prefer different types of rearing than other breeds?
I think they all do well in all of the different systems. When you're in a group system, you can really tell the differences in breeds with feeding. So the smaller Jersey sired animals tend to pull away from the mob feeder a lot faster because they're full. So they're not going to drink as much as what some of the bigger calves do. So, the bigger calves just get a little more milk, I guess, which is okay. So that's one thing that's been interesting to see.
You kind of self-regulate a little bit.
They do.
Yeah.
They're not going to, they're not going to gorge a lot. And we're only feeding, 5-6 liters per feeding. So they're not getting a lot at the time. Although on an auto feeder, I've had some calves drink 9 liters at one time. So man, that's been an interesting. I have seen calves slug feed on an auto feeder if you let them drink as much as what we want. So I ad-libbed some calves. Man, does that grow nice calves? I'll tell you that. But a calf will feed itself twice a day, and it'll drink 9 liters in the morning and 9 liters at night. That's what we found. It's quite interesting.
Have you had a chance as part of your cows on calf study? We talk about this a lot. I'll give a little bit of background. We talk about this a lot when we're talking about our beef on dairy calves, because I think half of the genetics of that calf is coming from a system where they're fed completely differently and they're mom fed, right? And we just don't have a lot of information about how beef cows feed their calves. Like, we know they do a good job, but I think we're missing a lot of data about that we just, because we can't survey them, right? You can't ask the cow what she's doing or the calf what they're getting. So have you been able, with this calves on cows study, have you been able to kind of get any of that feeding behavior? So I think, you just said that if you let calves feed themselves on an auto feeder, they're going to drink twice a day, they're going to slug feed. The cow will naturally prevent that from happening to some extent, right? Like, she's not going to have all of her milk at once. She, we've seen mamas just kind of, push them away, like, yeah, you're done, we're moving on. Like, so the cow kind of regulates the calf's behavior to some extent when they're when they're little. So have you been able to measure that or see anything?
Based on some observations, that the calves that are raised on the cows, they probably drink 4 or 5 times a day. So they're not slug feeding a lot. Mom's not letting them do that. So it's maybe more natural for them to drink lots of small meals during the day, which is kind of what we try to mimic on an auto feeder by letting, calves drink a couple liters every time. And I think that's more in tune with what the cow does versus, letting them come in and just slug feed a whole bunch. The cow typically wouldn't allow that, not at all.
No.
But I have one thing to think about is we've measured on the auto feeder how much these calves are drinking on an ad lib basis, and I have some that'll drink 20 to 25 liters of milk per day on an auto feeder. So we think, and based on growth and comparing growth on those calves versus calves raised on mom, that's what we think some of the calves, if they're drinking off a mom, are drinking too. They're drinking 8 gallons of milk a day. So they are consuming a lot of milk. And, man, 20 liters, that's a lot of milk. Yeah. And there's a big cost to that. There's a big cost to that.
Yeah, for sure. That's the other thing I think you've done that I don't think you mentioned, but you've done some precision technology stuff and validating precision technologies out in grazing systems. Is there any application for some of those precision technologies on calves, and maybe we can kind of monitor some of their feeding behavior, some of their calf behavior that way? You think there's potential for that?
Yeah, I think there is. We've done a lot of exploration of precision technologies on grazing animals and looking at feeding behavior, and you name it. We have some pedometers. We've put pedometers on all of these calves that were individually or raised on mom, and obviously the calves that are raised with mom have thousands of steps per day, and the calf in the individual hutch doesn't have very many. I also, so we have Cow Manager here. It's one of the technologies that we have, but I put it on some of those calves that were individually housed, and it's kind of interesting to look at the data and see what it is. The problem is that sometimes the drinking behavior shows up as rumination or things like that. So I'm not sure that, drinking behavior is really hard to distinguish in a precision technology system, especially for calves. So
yeah,
it may or may not work. I just put it on some calves to see what would happen, and that's kind of what it showed. A lot more rumination, and I'm like, those calves aren't ruminating.
I wonder what it must be like measuring suckling behaviors, rumination then.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I think that's what it's doing.
Yeah.
So it was kind of interesting to see what would happen. I'm not sure that, an ear tag technology would work for calves, but pedometers work. I have another one that we looked at, trying to look at steps, the amount of steps in an individual housing one, and see if you could correlate that with health of calves. The problem is our calves don't get sick here. Well,
oh no,
they don't get sick, but we have very few. Our death rate is less than 1% at 6 months of age, so we just don't have a lot of problems. So it's really hard to use some of these technologies to detect this stuff when you don't have sickness in your calves.
Yeah.
That's a good problem to have, right?
I'm not complaining about that. I don't want sick calves.
Well,
Brad,
I think go ahead, Jill.
I was going to say, before we let you go, you're on our podcast today, but you're not a stranger to podcasts. You're a little bit of a celebrity with your own podcast, right? Do you want to make a pitch for the Moose Room before we wrap up?
Sure. I don't know if we're celebrities or not, but myself, Joe Armstrong, and Emily Kreckelberg at University of Minnesota have a podcast. It's called the Moose Room, where we just, sit around and banter about beef and dairy topics. And we dabble a little bit in mental health topics, which has been quite interesting. And we've gotten lots of good feedback on that. So it's one of the few podcasts that does that from a livestock perspective. So yeah, feel free to check us out if you want.
That's Moose, M-O-O-S. So it's
the Moose Room, M-O-O-S.
And you always ask your guests 2 questions at the end of every podcast. Is that right?
2 questions at the beginning. Yeah.
At the beginning. Sorry, I'm confusing my podcast. So should we ask you the 2 questions before we conclude in Moose Room fashion? So what's your favorite breed of dairy cow is the first one, right?
Well, it is Jersey.
Oh, really?
There's another breed? I grew up showing jerseys and milking jerseys, so I am Jersey throughout.
All right. And then the second one would be, what is your favorite breed of beef?
It is Hereford.
Good choice.
It is Hereford. Why? Oh, dare to be different. Actually, my grandfather had Herefords as well, so you get ingrained in all of these wonderful breeds based on your history.
All right. Well, I don't hear any rebuttals about those breeds, so they must be acceptable to the rest of the team, right?
Exactly.
All right. Well, we appreciate you being on the call, Brad. And again, check out Moose Room. Also, your research is listed on your website. If you go to University of Minnesota or type in West Central Research and Outreach Center. I know we didn't cover all the projects that you have done, and there is just a lot of great information on that website about your projects. So encourage our audience to go there for more follow-up of your projects and information too. So thanks for being on, and we look forward to being with you again on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu. isu.edu/diversity/ext.